They did it because they did not think it counted. That is the part you will struggle with longest, and it is worth putting at the front rather than building toward, because everything else in this depends on it. Whatever they did, whatever form the betrayal took, they did not experience themselves as detonating a life. They experienced themselves as doing something small, something manageable. Something that existed in a category of behavior they had privately designated as not really part of the relationship, and therefore not subject to its terms. That designation is the engine of the entire thing. Avoidant people frequently maintain a zone of their life that they consider genuinely separate from the person they are with. Not as a plan, not as a conscious deception, but as a structural feature of how they stay in relationships at all. The zone is where they keep the parts of themselves they have never handed over to anyone, and its existence is what makes closeness survivable for them, and everything that happens inside it feels to them like it is happening somewhere the relationship does not reach. So when it happened, whatever it was, it did not register in their accounting the way it registered in yours. In yours, it was a rupture at the foundation. In theirs, it was an event in a room the relationship had never been admitted to. That gap is why the aftermath went the way it did, why the apology was flat, why the explanation was so inadequate. Why they seemed to be waiting for you to be finished being upset rather than absorbing what had actually occurred. They were not being callous, or at least not only that. They were responding proportionally to their own reading of the event, and their reading was smaller than yours by an enormous margin, and neither of you knew that you were operating from different measurements. And then it ruined their life, not immediately, not in the way the title suggests, with a sudden collapse and a visible catastrophe. That version is satisfying, and it is not usually what happens. What happens is slower, and it is structural, and it is worth understanding accurately, because the accurate version is more permanent than the dramatic one, and it also happens to be the version that lets you stop watching what they actually destroyed. Set aside for a moment what they did to you. That is the larger loss, and it will be addressed at length, but the mechanism of their own ruin is not primarily about the harm to you. It is about what the act removed from their own life, and they did not see it coming because they were not looking at that part. They destroyed the one relationship in which they had been genuinely known. Consider what that actually was. Here was a person whose entire adult life had been organized around maintaining a distance from everyone, who had never let anyone fully in, who had built a functioning identity out of self-sufficiency, and had never had to test whether the self-sufficiency was a preference or a limitation. And then there was you got in. Not by force, not by demanding it, but through the ordinary operation of paying close attention to someone over a long period. You noticed things nobody had noticed. You held things nobody had held. There were moments, and you remember them precisely, when the whole apparatus dropped and something underneath showed itself and was received without alarm. Those moments were the only ones of their kind in that person's life. That is not a romantic exaggeration. For someone who has never permitted full access to anyone, the handful of hours in which access was granted are structurally unique, and there is no replacement mechanism, because the access was not something they gave. It was something that happened, and it happened with a specific person, under conditions that took years to establish. That is what got destroyed. Not a relationship in the general sense which can be replaced, but a singular condition in which a permanently guarded person had been temporarily unguarded and had survived it, and they did not know that was what they were spending. That is the whole tragedy of it, and it is a real tragedy rather than a satisfying one. They were operating with a model in which the relationship was one relationship among the several they might have across a life, and in which this particular act was a contained event in a separate room, and both parts of the model were wrong, and the wrongness only became visible after the thing was gone. Why they could not see it at the time. There is a mechanism here worth understanding, because it explains something that otherwise looks like pure callousness and is closer to a form of blindness. Avoidant regulation works by suppressing the felt significance of attachment. That is its function. It does not remove the attachment, it removes access to how much it matters. A person operating this way can be profoundly bonded to someone and have almost no live sense of that bond, because the sense of it is exactly what the system is designed to keep offline. Which means that at the moment of the decision, whatever the decision was, they were consulting a reading of the relationship's value that was substantially lower than its actual value. Not because they were evaluating it dishonestly, because the instrument they were reading was calibrated to underreport. This is why the aftermath so often contains a bewildered quality on their side. They will say things like, "I do not know why I did it," and it will sound like an evasion, and it frequently is not one. They genuinely cannot reconstruct the decision, because the person who made it was operating with different information about what was at stake than the person now standing in the wreckage. None of this is exculpatory, and it should not be received that way. A person is responsible for the effects of their actions regardless of what their internal instrumentation was reporting. The explanation is not a defense. It is only an account of why the act was possible for someone who, from the outside, appeared to have every reason not to do it. And it is the reason the ruin is so total, because they did not spend something they knew to be precious. They spent something they had no access to the value of, and the value only became legible after the transaction was irreversible, and there is a particular quality to that kind of loss that ordinary regret does not reach. You cannot unlearn what something was worth once you find out the shape of the ruin. The word ruin implies something visible, a collapse others can see. And occasionally there is one, and if there was in your case you will know it, and it will have been less satisfying than you expected. But the ordinary version, the one that happens in almost every case of this kind, is not visible at all. It is structural, it happens over years, and it is more complete for being quiet. The first component is that the defense stops working. This is the part almost nobody anticipates. For their entire life, distance has functioned as a solution. When things got too close, they moved away, and the moving away resolved the discomfort, and the resolution confirmed the strategy. Every previous relationship ended in a way that validated the pattern. This one does not. Because the distance that used to be a solution now contains something new, which is the knowledge of what the distance costs. They will withdraw from the next person in the usual way at the usual point, and for the first time in their life, the withdrawal will not produce relief. It will produce a specific and recognizable emptiness because they have now had the experience of what is on the other side of not withdrawing, and having had it, the alternative is no longer neutral. That is not a temporary condition. Knowledge does not reverse. Every future retreat is now performed by someone who knows what retreat costs, which converts a lifelong strategy from a comfort into a compulsion they can feel themselves executing. The second component is that the story stops holding. Their identity was built on a particular account of themselves as someone who does not need much, independent, self-contained. Not the sort of person who is undone by a relationship. That account survived every prior ending, because every prior ending was one they had chosen and walked away from cleanly. This one produces evidence that does not fit. Something in them is not recovering on the expected schedule. They are experiencing a persistence of feeling that the story does not permit, and the persistence forces a revision, and the revision is not a comfortable one. It says that the self-sufficiency was never a strength. It was the shape of a limitation, and the limitation has now cost them something, and it will cost them again because they have no mechanism for changing it. The third component is the most durable. They now carry a permanent internal reference point, a standard against which every subsequent relationship is unconsciously measured and which nothing subsequent will meet, not because you were superhuman, but because the conditions cannot be reproduced. Nobody else will have spent years learning them the way you did. Nobody else will arrive with that much accumulated attention already invested. They will be in rooms for the rest of their life with people who are fine, and something will be missing, and they will not be able to say what. That is the ruin, not a collapse. A permanent low-grade knowledge that runs underneath an otherwise functional existence, surfacing at intervals, never resolving, never producing enough pressure to force change, and never fully going away. Why this is not satisfying and should not be. Here is where this has to turn, because there is a version of the above that you can live inside for years, and living inside it will cost you more than the betrayal did. Everything described about their trajectory is real. It is also not yours, and the moment it becomes the organizing principle of your recovery, you have handed them the rest of your life along with everything they already took. The mechanism is simple and it catches almost everyone. You are in enormous pain, and the pain has no available resolution, and the story of their eventual ruin offers a resolution. It provides a future in which the ledger balances, and so you begin quietly to live in that future, checking on it periodically, adjusting the timeline, looking for evidence. What that does is keep the file open. Every check restarts the process. Every piece of information about their life reinstalls them in yours. And the years pass, and the balancing you are waiting for either does not arrive or arrives in a form too small to register, and you find that you have spent a substantial portion of your one life monitoring the consequences of an act committed against you by a person you no longer know. There is also a harder problem with the revenge frame, which is that it makes your peace conditional on their suffering, which means you cannot achieve it alone, which means you have to keep watching to find out whether you are allowed to be all right yet, and the watching is itself the injury continuing. The ruin is real. It is also not a project you have any part in, and not a return you should be waiting to collect. what the betrayal actually told you. Set their story aside now, permanently if you can, and look at what the event delivered to you, because it delivered something, and it was not only damage. It told you the truth about the whole thing in a single stroke, and it told you at a speed no amount of conversation would have achieved. Think about what you were doing before it happened. You were in an extended process of interpretation. You had a person whose behavior was ambiguous, whose commitment was undefined, whose availability fluctuated, and you were spending an enormous percentage of your attention constructing a version of events in which all of it was survivable. Every inconsistency got processed and resolved. Every disappointment was absorbed and reframed. That process could have continued indefinitely. There was no natural end to it because the ambiguity was self-renewing, and each individual instance was small enough to be explained. You could have spent 5 more years in that room, and many people do. The betrayal ended it, not because it was worse than everything before, though it was, but because it was unambiguous. There was no interpretation available that made it fit. It exceeded the capacity of the machinery you had built for making things fit. That is what it gave you, not clarity in the pleasant sense. A forced exit from a process that had no other exit. You would not have chosen it. Nobody would. But it is worth being accurate about what it accomplished, which is that it terminated something that was not going to terminate on its own, and it did so before another decade went into it. The question of whether you missed the signs. You are asking this, or you will be, and it deserves a direct answer rather than reassurance. You did not miss them, you saw them. That is a different thing, and the distinction matters enormously. Go back and check. There was a period, probably weeks and possibly months, before you knew when something was off. You noticed a change in a rhythm, a quality of distraction, a slight alteration in the texture of how they were with you that you could not point to, but that registered. You brought it up, possibly in some soft form, and you were told there was nothing, and you accepted the answer and filed the perception away. You did not fail to detect it. You detected it and then overrode your own detection, which is a specific behavior with a specific origin, and the origin is not stupidity. You overrode it because naming it would have required a confrontation you had learned. From that relationship produced withdrawal. Because you had a working model of yourself as someone who was too sensitive, and the model had been reinforced steadily for years by a person whose comfort depended on your not trusting your own read. Because the alternative to overriding it was a level of disruption you were not, at that moment, in a position to survive. That is not a failure of perception. It is a functioning perception in an environment that punished acting on it, and it means the thing to take forward is not become more observant. You are already more observant than almost anyone. It is act on what you observe earlier in a smaller form, before the evidence has to become undeniable in order to be permitted. That single adjustment is the only one this experience actually requires of you, and it is worth more than anything you could learn about them. The specific injury of being betrayed by someone who was already distant. There is something particular about this configuration that makes it worse than an ordinary betrayal, and it is rarely named, and naming it helps. When a present, warm, fully engaged partner betrays someone, the injury is enormous and it has a comprehensible shape. Something good was happening and it was interrupted by a decision. The victim has a solid before to grieve. You do not have that. Your before was already difficult. You had already been absorbing insufficiency for years. You had already been the one doing the work, holding the structure, making the ambiguity livable. And then on top of that accumulated deficit, this. Which means the betrayal did not interrupt something good. It arrived at the end of a long period of you giving more than you received, and it functions in your accounting as the final entry in a ledger that was already badly imbalanced. That produces a specific and particularly corrosive thought, which is, I gave all of that and this is what it purchased. The thought is understandable and it contains an error. It treats the years as an investment that was supposed to yield the outcome, and the betrayal as the final return on the investment. Under that framing, the whole period becomes a loss with a punchline. But the years were not an investment in a future outcome. They were a period of your life in which things happened. Some of them were good and were genuinely good, not retroactively canceled by what came after. You loved someone, which is a real activity with its own value, and you did it well, and doing it well is not invalidated by the recipient's behavior. The betrayal is a fact about them. It is not a verdict on the quality of what you did. That distinction takes a long time to install, and it is the difference between coming out of this with a story about your own foolishness and coming out with a story about someone else's limitation. What they will say about why. At some point you may receive an explanation, or you may already have received one, and it will be inadequate, and it is worth understanding why in advance so that its inadequacy does not become another injury. The explanation will be one of a small number of things: that they were not thinking, that it did not mean anything, that they were in a bad place, that they had felt disconnected, that they do not know why they did it. Every one of those will feel like an evasion. Some of them will be, and several of them uncomfortably, are the closest thing to an accurate report that this particular person is capable of producing. Consider what an adequate explanation would require. It would require them to reconstruct their own internal state at the time of the decision, identify the mechanism that produced it, connect that mechanism to a lifelong pattern, and articulate it in a way that acknowledges the effect on you. That is a substantial piece of psychological work. Most people cannot do it about their own behavior in any domain. A person whose primary defense is the suppression of emotional self-awareness specifically cannot do it here. So you are asking for an output from a system that does not manufacture it, and the failure to receive it registers as an additional refusal when it is closer to an incapacity. This matters practically because a great many people stay in contact well past the point of usefulness, trying to extract an explanation that will make the thing make sense. The explanation does not exist, not in a form that would satisfy you. Not because they are withholding it, but because the account you want has never been generated by anyone, including them, and cannot be produced on demand by a person who has spent their life not looking at themselves. You will have to make sense of it without their help. That is unfair, and it is the actual situation. The thing you will do to yourself. There is a behavior that begins almost immediately, and that can continue for years, and it should be named because it is nearly universal, and almost nobody recognizes it as a behavior rather than as thinking. You will run the timeline. You will go back through the months preceding the discovery and re-experience specific days with the new information layered over them. That dinner, that weekend, the conversation where they said the thing, each one gets reviewed, and in the new viewing you can see what was actually happening, and the seeing is unbearable, and you do it anyway repeatedly, sometimes for hours. This is not processing. Processing has a terminal condition. This does not. It is a loop, and the loop is powered by an impossible goal, which is to locate the moment where the outcome could have been changed. There is no such moment. That is what the loop is looking for, and it is not there because the outcome was produced by a mechanism inside another person that you had no access to. The timeline can be run 1,000 times and it will not yield an intervention point because there was not one. What helps is not stopping the loop by force, which does not work. It is noticing each time it starts what it is searching for, naming the search. I am looking for the place where I could have prevented this. And then supplying the answer, which is that there is no such place and that the search has been run many times and has returned nothing on every occasion. That does not end it immediately. It ends it eventually, through repetition, in the same way anything is unlearned. The loop also has a physical component, and it responds better to physical intervention than to insight. It runs hardest when you are tired, alone, and lying down, which is why it is a night phenomenon. Sleep is therefore the highest return intervention available, and almost nobody prioritizes it because it feels irrelevant to a problem that presents as emotional. It is not irrelevant. A dysregulated body produces the loop. Handle the body and the loop diminishes. Why this did not happen because of anything you lacked. There is a particular version of self-blame that arrives with betrayal specifically, and it is different from the ordinary kind, and it needs to be dismantled directly. It says, if I had been enough, this would not have happened. That sentence has enormous intuitive force because it appears to explain everything, and because it locates the cause in something you could theoretically have controlled, which is more tolerable than randomness. It is also false, and the falseness is demonstrable rather than merely comforting. Consider the mechanism. Whatever they did, it occurred in the zone they maintained separately from the relationship. The existence of that zone is not responsive to the quality of the relationship. It does not shrink when things go well. In many cases, the opposite happens because when the primary relationship deepens, the pressure to maintain a separate compartment increases, since the compartment is what makes the depth survivable, which means the better it got, the more the mechanism was activated. That is a horrible thing to understand, and it is the accurate reading of a great many of these cases. You could not have prevented it by being more. More was structurally part of what produced it, and the other direction is equally closed. You could not have prevented it by being less, unless less meant so little that you were never really in the relationship at all, which is not prevention, it is absence. There was no version of you that fixes this. That is the fact. It is not a comfort exactly because it removes the illusion of control, but it does remove a false debt, and false debts are expensive to carry. The difference between what they did and who you are. There is a translation that happens after betrayal, and it happens fast, and it is the single most damaging thing about the experience. The event gets converted into information about your worth. The conversion is automatic and it does not require your consent. Something happened to you, and the mind, which is built to find causes, looks for the property that produced it. And the most available property is you, because you are the one thing that was present throughout. But consider the logic. If their behavior measured your worth, then it would have varied with your worth, and it did not. It varied with their internal state, their circumstances, their level of activation, none of which tracked anything you did. You have watched this person be warm and distant in alternation for years without any corresponding change in your behavior. You have the data. Their output was never a function of your input. Which means their behavior cannot be read as a measurement, because a measurement has to respond to the thing being measured, and this did not. That argument will not land emotionally for a while. Arguments do not reach the part of you that is currently making this conversion. But it is worth holding as a formal matter, so that when the conversion happens you can at least identify it as a process occurring rather than as a discovery being made. You are not learning something about yourself right now. You are experiencing a mechanism. What ruin actually means for someone like this. Return to their side once more, and then it will be set down for good. The reason the word ruin fits, despite the absence of any visible collapse, is that what has been damaged is not their circumstances, but their capacity for a specific kind of experience. Here is what that means concretely. Before this, they had a life organized around distance, and the organization was untested. They had never had the experience of being fully known and had therefore never had to reckon with whether the distance was costing them anything. The strategy was, from inside, free. It is no longer free. They have now had the experience and lost it through their own action, and every subsequent relationship will be conducted by a person carrying that knowledge. Which means the distance is now something they will feel, not as an abstraction, as an ongoing sensation of not quite, present in every room permanently. That is not a punishment. Nobody is administering it. It is simply what happens when a person discovers, too late, the value of something they were structurally unable to hold, and there is a second-order effect that is worse. Having done this once, they now know they are capable of it, which introduces a permanent instability into every future commitment they make. They will not be able to fully trust their own reliability because they have direct evidence against it. That produces either a defensive minimization, in which case nothing changes and the pattern repeats, or a genuine and uncomfortable self-knowledge that they will have to live with. Most people take the first option. That is not a prediction that they will be fine. Minimization is not peace. It is a maintenance cost, paid continuously, forever, to keep a piece of self-knowledge from surfacing. That is the whole of it. It is not dramatic, and it does not resolve, and it is more permanent than a collapse would be. Set it down now. It is complete, and it is not yours. What is actually happening to you right now? Come back to the present, which is where the useful work is. You are in a physiological state, not only an emotional one, and the distinction matters because it changes what helps. Betrayal produces a stress response that is closer to trauma physiology than to ordinary grief. The features are recognizable: intrusive images, hypervigilance, which shows up as an inability to stop scanning for information, disrupted sleep with early waking, a sense of unreality about ordinary things, physical symptoms with no medical cause, frequently in the chest or the stomach. None of these are indications that you are handling it badly. They are the standard output of a system that has registered a threat to something it treats as survival relevant, which is what a primary attachment is at the level where this operates. The implication is that insight has limited leverage here. You could understand this situation perfectly, and the physiology would continue. Most people spend the first months trying to think their way out and interpret the failure as evidence that they have not understood well enough, and so they think harder, which makes it worse, because rumination is the primary maintenance mechanism for the state. What actually works is unglamorous. Sleep, protected deliberately, treated as the priority it is. Sustained physical exertion, which discharges the stress response in a way nothing cognitive can. Long walks, which do something specific through the combination of rhythm and duration. Regular eating, even without appetite. Other people's physical presence, even when you do not want it, and even when you say nothing. And professional support, if you can access it, is worth considering here more than an ordinary heartbreak, because betrayal trauma has features that respond well to specific approaches and that do not resolve as reliably on their own. None of that is a suggestion that your feelings are a medical problem. It is a recognition that a large part of what you are experiencing is happening in a system that does not read the trust you think you have lost. There is a fear underneath the whole of this, and it is not about them. and it is the one that actually determines what the next decade looks like. The fear is that you will never be able to trust anyone again. It presents as a conclusion rather than a fear, which is how you can tell it is operating. It arrives with a feeling of certainty. Of course I will not trust anyone. Look what happened when I did. Here is what is actually true about that. Trust is not a fixed quantity that was depleted. It is a process, and what has been damaged is not your capacity for it but your calibration, and calibration is repairable in a way that capacity would not be. Specifically, what has broken is the connection between your perception and your action. You perceived accurately during that relationship consistently for years. What you did not do was act on the perception, because acting on it had been made expensive. So the thing that failed was not your ability to read people, it was your willingness to respond to your own reading. That is much better news than it feels like, because it means the repair is not a matter of learning to detect deception, which is difficult and unreliable. It is a matter of permitting yourself to act on detections you are already making, which is a decision rather than a skill. There is a period after this where you will overdetect. Ordinary human inconsistency will register as threat. Someone will be slow to reply, and you will feel the whole thing again. That overfiring is normal, and it is temporary, and it settles, and the settling happens through repeated exposure to people who turn out to be reliable, which requires you to be around people, which is why isolation extends this more than anything else. You will trust again, differently, with verification instead of hope. That is not a diminished version of trust. That is what adult trust actually is, and most people arrive at it through some version of what you are going through, the anger you have not reached yet. For many people in this situation, there is an emotion that has not yet arrived, and its absence is being misread as evidence of something. You may not be angry yet. You may be devastated, disoriented, obsessive, unable to eat, and entirely lacking in the clean anger that everyone around you seems to expect. People will ask why you are not furious, and you will not have an answer. The reason is usually that anger requires a stable sense of having been owed something, and that sense is exactly what is currently unstable. If some part of you is still evaluating whether you deserved this, anger cannot form, because anger presupposes the verdict that self-blame is still contesting. So the anger arrives later, and when it does, it arrives disproportionately, and it will feel like a regression. It is not. It is the most reliable single marker that the self-blame is receding, because the two occupy the same space and only one can be there at a time. When it comes, do not manage it. Do not soften it for anyone's comfort, including your own. Do not convert it prematurely into understanding, which is a move you are particularly prone to, because your instinct is to comprehend rather than to be angry, and comprehension is a very effective way of not feeling something. You understand this situation extremely well already. You have understood it from the beginning. What you have not done is be angry about it, and that is the part that is missing, and it is finite and it burns through. What is on the other side of it is not bitterness. It is the plain, settled sense that something was done to you that was not acceptable and that you will not accept again. That sense is the actual protection going forward, and it cannot be installed by understanding. Only by having been angry, why you are still defending them. There is something you are probably still doing, and it is worth catching because it will extend this considerably. You are still, in some part of your mind, constructing the version in which it was not that bad, finding the interpretation, considering their circumstances. Explaining to yourself, if not to anyone else, why it happened and what was going on for them and how it fits into a larger picture that makes it comprehensible. That is the interpretation service, and it did not shut off when the relationship ended. It has been running for years, and it is automatic, and it has simply changed subjects. Notice what it is protecting. It is not protecting them. They are not present and receive no benefit. It is protecting you from the full weight of a fact you are not yet ready to hold, which is that someone you loved did something that cannot be reframed. That protection is not stupid. It is a pacing mechanism. Facts of this size arrive in installments for a reason, and the reason is that the whole thing at once would be more than the system can process. So do not force it, but do notice it, because there is a point at which the pacing mechanism becomes a residence, and the sign of that transition is when you find yourself defending them to other people. When a friend says something plainly true about what happened and you find yourself qualifying it, that is the moment to watch for. Explaining it to yourself in private is metabolism. Defending it out loud to someone on your side is something else, and it means the mechanism has captured you, and the correction is simply to stop mid-sentence and let the plain version stand without amendment. You do not have to condemn them. You only have to stop doing the work of making it acceptable, which is work and which you are doing and which nobody is paying you for. What the betrayal ended that you should not mourn. There is an inventory worth taking, because some of what ended was costing you and you have been counting it as loss. The vigilance ended. You will not fully appreciate this for months, but a substantial part of your daily cognitive load was devoted to monitoring, checking the temperature, reading the tone of a message for information about where things stood, assessing continuously whether the connection was intact today. That process ran in the background at all times, and it consumed real resources, and it is gone. The interpretation ended, or it will. The work of taking ambiguous behavior and converting it into something livable. That was a full-time position, and you were unpaid, and it has been eliminated. The waiting ended. This is the large one. For years, the central question of your life was pending, and everything else was provisional because the answer would determine so much. That question has been answered, horribly not the way you wanted, and answered, which means that for the first time in a long period, nothing about your future is contingent on another person's internal state. The self-suppression ended, or it can now. All the things you did not say because saying them produced withdrawal, all the requirements you softened. All the reactions you edited before they were expressed, that whole apparatus has no function anymore, and it will begin to dismantle unevenly over the next year. None of this makes the betrayal good. It was not good, but an accurate accounting includes what was released, and the release is substantial, and you are currently counting only the losses. The thing about being chosen against. There is a particular sting in betrayal that is separate from the deception, and it is worth isolating because it is the part that lasts. It is the sense of having been ranked, that in some moment some choice was made, and you were not the thing that governed it. That reading is what makes betrayal feel like a statement about your value, and it is worth examining because the reading assumes a deliberateness that these acts usually do not contain. There was, in most cases, no moment of comparison. Nobody held you up against something and selected. What happened was a sequence of small permissions, each one individually minor, none of them experienced at the time as a decision about you. That is how almost all of these things actually occur, not as a choice against someone, but as a series of steps taken in a compartment where the person was not thinking about you at all. Which is, in a way, worse and is also entirely different from what you are currently feeling. Being unconsidered is not the same as being weighed and found wanting. It is not a statement about your value because no statement was made. The absence of a statement is hard to grieve because there is nothing to argue with. But it does mean that the specific thing tormenting you, the sense of having been assessed and rejected, is describing an event that did not take place. You were not chosen against. You were, for a period, not thought about. That is a real and serious failure, and it is a failure of their attention rather than a judgment on your worth. What comes back first? There is an order to the recovery, and knowing it prevents you from misreading the sequence. The first thing that returns is not happiness, it is competence. Somewhere in the second or third month, you will notice that you handled something well. A work problem, a difficult conversation, a logistical mess. You will handle it and afterwards realize that you did it without the enormous effort that everything has required lately. That is the first sign, and it is easy to miss because it does not feel like anything. The second thing is humor. This is a strange and consistent marker. Somewhere before the pain has meaningfully lifted, the ability to find things funny comes back, often abruptly, often in an inappropriate context. Humor requires a kind of relaxed attention that is impossible while a large percentage of your processing is committed to threat, and its return means the underlying system is intact and is coming back online. The third is interest. Something will catch your attention for its own sake rather than as a distraction. A subject, a project, a person's story. It will feel small, and it is not small because interest is the thing that was most comprehensively removed. The fourth, and it comes considerably later, is the return of appetite for the future. The ability to picture something ahead and feel something about it. That one takes the longest because the future was where the projection lived, and the projection was destroyed, and the machinery has to build a new one. Happiness is not on this list because it does not arrive as an item. It accumulates out of the other four, and by the time you notice it, it will have been present for some weeks. The practical question of contact. There will be a question about whether to have contact, and the answer depends on circumstances, but the principle is consistent. If there is no logistical entanglement, the answer is no contact, and the reason is not moral. It is that each contact restarts a process that requires uninterrupted time to complete. The attachment system extinguishes through the absence of reinforcement, and every interaction is reinforcement regardless of its emotional content. A hostile exchange reinforces as effectively as a warm one. If there is entanglement, and there frequently is, the principle is to reduce contact to the logistics and remove everything else. This is harder than it sounds because they may attempt to reopen other channels, and because you will be tempted to as well, usually in the form of one more attempt to get an adequate explanation. The explanation will not be adequate. It has already been established that it cannot be. Each attempt to obtain it costs you a week. There is one exception worth naming. If you need something practical, information, an item, a signature, get it efficiently and treat the exchange as a transaction with a stranger. You are allowed to be brief and unwarm without that constituting a failure of your own character. Politeness is not owed to someone in the aftermath of this and the belief that it will be used against you, and do not communicate the decision. Announcing that you are going no contact converts the absence into a message, and messages can be waited out. Simply stop. The distinction is not petty. It is the difference between a strategy and a fact, what you are going to believe and should not. There are 4 conclusions that form after this, and all 4 are false, and all 4 will govern your next several years, unless they are caught. The first is that you should have known. Everyone concludes this, and it is uniformly wrong, because the person concluding it has information that was not available at the time. The pattern is legible now because you have the ending, and the ending is what makes the sequence readable. Without it, the individual signals were genuinely ambiguous, and interpreting them charitably was the reasonable response to ambiguous data from someone you had reason to trust. The second is that love makes you stupid. It does not. What it does is raise the cost of acting on unwelcome information, which is different. Your reasoning was intact throughout. What was compromised was your willingness to act, and the compromise was produced by the situation rather than by a defect in you. The third is that everyone does this. This is the protective overcorrection, and it feels like wisdom. It is not. Most people do not do this. The reason it feels universal is that you are currently sampling from a population of 1, and 1 is not a sample. Generalizing from this event to all human beings is the same error as generalizing from a single relationship to your own worth, just pointed outward instead of inward. The fourth is that you can prevent this in future by being more guarded. You cannot. Guardedness does not prevent betrayal. It only reduces the quality of everything else. What prevents the years is not detection at the front end, but response speed in the middle. You cannot know in advance who will do this. You can absolutely notice within weeks when something has changed and act on the noticing instead of overriding it. Notice which of these you have adopted. Most people take at least 2, and the 2 chosen tend to determine whether the next decade is spent recovering or defending the version of you that existed before. There is someone worth remembering and finding again, and finding them is a substantial part of what comes next. Before this, there was a version of you who assumed good faith without effort, who did not scan, who could receive a delayed reply without a spike. That person existed, and they are not gone, though at the moment they may feel unreachable, and there is a fear that they were naive and deserved what happened. They were not naive. They were operating with a default that is correct in most environments, and that was, in this one instance, exploited. A default that is correct most of the time is a good default. The occasional catastrophic failure of a good default does not make it a bad one. The question is what you do with that person now, and there are 2 available options, and one of them is much worse than it looks. The worse one is to retire them. To conclude that openness was the vulnerability, and to construct a permanently guarded replacement. That does work in a narrow sense. It reduces the probability of a repeat. It also removes your access to the thing you actually want, which requires openness by definition, and it produces a person who is safe and cannot be reached, including by themselves. The better one is to keep them and add a limit, same defaults, same willingness to go first, same assumption of good faith, and a new rule, which is that when the perception says something has changed, the perception gets acted on within days rather than being overridden for months. That is a small modification to a functioning system. It is not a personality transplant, and it is the only change this experience actually requires of you, the loneliness of the specific situation. There is an isolation in this that deserves acknowledgement because it makes everything harder, and because most people going through it think it is unique to them. Almost nobody around you will be able to hold it properly. The people who love you will offer consolations built on models that do not fit. They will say you are better off, which is true and unhelpful in the acute phase. They will say they will get what they deserve, which reintroduces waiting. They will say you deserve better, which assumes it was about deserving. They will ask at some point whether you saw it coming, and the question will land badly no matter how kindly it is meant. None of this is a failure of their care. It is that this configuration, betrayal inside a relationship that was already asymmetric, is specific and unusual, and requires understanding things about attachment that most people have no reason to know. 2 things help. One is finding a single person who does understand, and there usually is one, often someone who has lived a version of it. They do not need to advise. They need to say the sentence that indicates comprehension, and comprehension from one person is worth more than sympathy from 20. The other is receiving the ordinary consolations as what they are, which is not analysis but company. When someone says you deserve better, they are not making an argument. They are saying I am here and I am on your side. Received as an argument, it is unsatisfying. Received as presence, it is exactly right. Do not correct people. They are not trying to solve it. Letting them be with you imperfectly is better than being accurately alone. The long view on this. Zoom out, because the time scale you are living in is distorting everything. You are measuring in days, and at that resolution, nothing visible happens. Real change in this process moves at something like a few percent per month, which means that on any given day, compared with yesterday, there is no progress. And the absence of visible progress reads as evidence that you are not recovering, which produces its own despair, and the despair is a symptom rather than information. Compare with 6 weeks ago instead. That comparison will almost always show something. There is a second distortion, which is that the acute state generates a prediction of its own permanence. Everyone in this condition believes they will feel this way indefinitely, and almost nobody does, and the belief is manufactured by the state rather than derived from any evidence. You have had this experience before with something else, some earlier loss that felt terminal and is now a thing that happened. Try to recall the texture of being inside it. You believed then, too, that it would not lift. At the 2-year mark, people describe this consistently and briefly. They describe it as the event that ended a period of their life that needed ending, and they describe it without much heat, and the description is far shorter than the one you would give now. That compression is not denial. It is what time does to everything, including things that felt like they would define you permanently, what you will take from this. There is something acquired here, and it is worth extracting deliberately rather than hoping it accrues. You now know what your own perception feels like when it is accurate and being overridden. That is a specific somatic signature, and you have had months of exposure to it. You will recognize it instantly for the rest of your life, and the recognition will arrive well before your analysis catches up, and it will save you years in situations that have nothing to do with romance. You now know that a person's behavior toward you is not a measurement of your worth, not as a slogan. As direct experience, which is entirely different, because you watched someone behave in ways that had no relationship to anything you did. You now know the difference between someone who cannot and someone who will not, and more usefully you know that from the receiving end they are identical. Which means you will stop making the distinction, because it only ever mattered as a route to hope, and hope in that direction is what kept you in the room. And you know you survive things. That sounds like the kind of thing said to fill space, and it is the most practically useful item on the list. You are currently inside the worst version of an experience, and you are functioning. Working, maintaining relationships, handling logistics. You will not count that as anything, and it is the whole of what matters, because it is direct evidence about your own capacity under maximum load, and you will have it available every time something difficult happens for the rest of your life. The days that will be hardest. They are specific rather than general, and they are predictable enough to prepare for. The day something surfaces that you had not known. Betrayals frequently arrive in installments, and each installment reopens the whole thing, and the reopening is worse than the original because it destabilizes the account you had just finished building. If this happens, know that the second discovery is not evidence that you understand nothing. It is the ordinary structure of how these things come out. The day of an anniversary, not necessarily the relationships, often something incidental, a date that carried meaning for a reason nobody else would recognize. The intensity on those days is a property of the calendar rather than a signal about your progress. The day something good happens to you, this one surprises people. The reflex to tell them outlives the relationship by a long margin, and the reflex fires before your reasoning gets there, and the small collision between the impulse and the reality is disproportionately painful for how brief it is. The day you encounter something ordinary that carries the whole thing, a street, a song, a smell, an object in the back of a drawer, these arrive without warning and bypass every piece of understanding you have assembled because they deliver directly to a system that does not process arguments. The day you are simply depleted. No trigger, no date, no news. Just tired, and the tiredness lowers the barrier and the loop walks in. This is the most dangerous because there is no story attached and therefore nothing obvious to counter. Prepare mechanically rather than emotionally. Decide now while you are clear what you will do, not what you will feel, where the phone goes, who you contact, what the specific replacement action is. Decisions made in advance by a clear version of you are the only thing that reliably survives contact with a depleted version at 11 at night. Why you keep wanting them to know. There is a persistent wish underneath everything, and it deserves direct treatment because it will not go away on its own. You want them to understand what they did, not to apologize necessarily, to comprehend. To hold accurately the full weight of the thing from your side in detail and to be unable to put it down. That wish is not vindictiveness, it is something more fundamental. It is the desire for the experience to have been witnessed. Because right now you are the only person who holds the complete account, and holding it alone is a specific kind of burden, and the wish for them to know it is really a wish to not be the only one carrying it. Here is the difficulty: they cannot know it. Not because they refuse, but because knowing it would require the sustained empathic reconstruction of another person's inner experience, and that is precisely the capacity the pattern suppresses. It is the same capacity whose absence made the betrayal possible in the first place, which means you are waiting for an output from the exact system that is defined by not producing it. The account exists, you have it. It is complete and detailed and accurate, and it does not require a second signature to be valid. The witnessing you want is available, and it is available from other people and from yourself, and the belief that it has to come from the person who caused the harm is a belief worth examining, because it makes your resolution dependent on the least capable party. You will not be told, make peace with that early rather than in 3 years, because until you do, part of your life stays in escrow waiting for a payment that will not clear. What you should do with the urge to expose. There is a specific impulse that arrives in this situation, and it is worth handling carefully, because it feels like justice and it usually functions as something else. The urge is to make it known, to tell the people around them, to ensure that the account circulating is the accurate one rather than the sanitized version, to not be the only one holding it. That impulse is understandable, and it comes from the same place as the wish above, which is the need for the thing to be witnessed. It also has consequences you cannot control, and it puts you into a role you do not want. There is a distinction worth making. Telling your own people what happened to you is not exposure. It is the ordinary act of describing your own life to those in it, and you are entitled to do it without hedging, without protecting anyone's reputation, in whatever detail you need. Anyone who tells you that describing your own experience is inappropriate is asking you to carry it silently for the comfort of someone who did not extend you the same consideration. Campaigning is different. Contacting people who were not part of your life, constructing an audience, managing the reception of a story. That converts you into a person whose current project is the reputation of someone who is no longer in their life, and the project has no completion condition, and it keeps them installed at the center of your days for as long as it runs. The test is simple. Are you telling people in order to be known, or in order to affect an outcome over there? The first one is healthy and finite. The second one is a job you have given yourself and will not be able to quit, what rebuilding actually involves. There is a stage after the acute phase that is less discussed, and that determines the shape of the next several years. It is not about them at all. It is about the specific habits that were installed in you during the relationship and that are still running now that the relationship has ended. The self-suppression is still running. You are still in conversations with other people, editing before you speak, still qualifying, still deciding that a reaction is disproportionate before checking whether it is. The vigilance is still running. You are still reading tone and messages from people who have given you no reason to, still assessing whether things are all right with someone who is simply busy. The over-explaining is still running. You are still building cases for your own feelings rather than stating them, because for years feelings required documentation before they were permitted. Those are the residue, and they will outlast the grief by a considerable margin, and they are the actual work, and they are addressable in a way that the grief is not, because they are behaviors rather than states. The practice is observation rather than force. Each day, notice one instance in which you treated yourself the way you were treated. Do not fix it, count it. Observation alone does most of the work because these patterns depend on being invisible and lose efficiency once seen. What that produces over months is a person with different defaults who did not have to decide to have them. Requirements return on their own once the suppression is interrupted, in the same way that a filter recalibrates once you stop overriding it. The freedom you have not noticed. There is something available now that was not available for the whole duration, and you have probably not registered it because it does not announce itself. Nothing about your life is currently contingent on another person's internal state. For years, the central fact of your existence was pending, whether this would hold, whether they would arrive. Whether the thing you were building would be recognized. That question sat above everything and made every decision provisional because you could not commit fully to any direction while the largest variable was being determined elsewhere. It has been answered, terribly and answered, which means you can plan, you can decide where to live without calculating the effect. You can take something that would have been impossible. You can direct your own life without running every choice through a filter about how it affects a possibility that was never going to materialize. That freedom is currently unpleasant, because freedom arriving through loss always is, and because you did not choose it. It is nonetheless real and substantial, and it is the largest practical change in your circumstances. Most people in the year after something like this do something they had been postponing. Move, change, work, begin something. Not as a reaction and not as a performance for anyone, but because a large obstruction has been removed and things become possible that were not. Watch for what becomes possible. It will not present as an opportunity. It will just be a thing you notice you could do now, if they come back. It happens frequently enough in this configuration that it is worth walking through in advance while you are clear, because if it happens, you will not be. The return, if it comes, will not arrive with a plan. It will be exploratory. It will contain warmth and remorse and an acknowledgement, and the acknowledgement will be general rather than specific. I did not know what I had. I was not in a good place. I have been thinking about you constantly. Notice what is absent from all of those, any description of your experience, any specific account of what they did and what it cost. Any statement of what would be structurally different and how it would be achieved. That absence is diagnostic. Specificity requires having reconstructed your side, which requires the capacity that is missing. A general acknowledgement is what remorse looks like when it has been felt but not examined, and felt but unexamined remorse produces contact rather than change. Your body will respond before you do. If the bond was strong, and it was, the response to their return is not something you decide. It arrives fast and it will feel like proof of something. It is not proof of anything except that attachment systems are powerful and do not update on the timeline of insight. The question to hold is not whether you still love them. You probably do, and the answer does not tell you anything actionable. The question is what has changed in their capacity, and the evidence for that is not statements. It is sustained work over a long period, undertaken during your absence, without expectation of your knowing about it. Almost always there is not, because loss produces motivation and motivation produces contact, and by the time actual work would show results, the motivation has faded. And there is one additional thing here that does not apply to ordinary breakups. The specific act happened, whatever it was. And the question of whether a relationship can be rebuilt after it is a real question with a real answer in some cases. And the answer depends on things that take a very long time to establish and cannot be established through a conversation in the first months. If you are considering it, the only responsible version involves professional support, a long timeline, and a level of transparency they have never demonstrated. Anything faster than that is the old configuration with new vocabulary. The grief you have not named. Underneath the betrayal and the anger and the timeline running, there is a loss that most people never identify, and identifying it releases something. You are grieving the version of yourself who trusted that person. That version was not foolish. They were generous and they went first, and they extended something without requiring it to be earned in advance. That is not a weakness, it is the precondition for every close relationship anyone has ever had, and it worked in your life many times before it failed here. And you had to end them in a sense to survive this. You had to become someone who knows what you now know. That loss is the deepest one in the whole thing, and it is rarely named because it has no obvious object. You are not grieving a person or a future. You are grieving a way of being in the world that you cannot return to now that you know what you know. Grieve it properly rather than rushing past it into a hardened version, because the hardened version is not the only alternative to the trusting one. What you are moving toward is a third thing. Someone who still goes first, still assumes good faith, still extends something before it is earned, and who also acts on their perceptions within days rather than months. That person is not less generous than the one you were. They are generous with a working immune system. The transition between those two is what you are inside right now, and it has no clear midpoint, and the discomfort of it is not evidence that something permanent has been lost. What their life looks like in 10 years. Since the title raises it, it deserves a final honest treatment, and then it should be closed. In 10 years, they will most likely have a life that looks acceptable from outside. Some structure, some people, some work, not a visible ruin, nothing anyone would point at, and underneath it, running continuously, a low-grade knowledge that surfaces at intervals. that there was a period years ago when someone knew them completely and it was survivable, and that they destroyed it for reasons they still cannot articulate, and that nothing since has approached it. They will not be able to say this to anyone. That is part of the structure. The people in their life will not know that a comparison is running. It will emerge occasionally, unbidden in a quiet hour, and be suppressed and return. That is what ruin means for someone whose defense is the suppression of feeling, not collapse. A permanent, unresolvable knowledge in a person who has no mechanism for resolving anything. You do not need to check on it. It does not require your attendance. It is not a project with milestones, and it will not produce an event you can witness, and it will not culminate in a moment where you are vindicated. Set it down, not out of generosity. Because carrying it costs you something and returns nothing, and you have already paid more than enough into this. Why it was never about what you did or did not do. There is a category of question that will occupy you for months if it is not closed, and it is worth closing directly. The questions all have the same shape. Should I have been more affectionate? Should I have asked more questions? Should I have been less available or more or different in some way that would have prevented it? Should I have pushed harder for definition? Should I have left earlier? Every one of those assumes that the outcome was responsive to your input, and the entire history of that relationship is a record of it not being responsive to your input. Think about the evidence you already have. Over years, you varied your behavior enormously. There were periods when you were more available and periods when you pulled back, periods when you asked for more and periods when you asked for nothing, periods when things were good and you were relaxed and periods when you were anxious and pressing. And across all of that variation, their pattern remained constant. The same withdrawals at the same thresholds, the same vagueness about the same subjects, the same inability to sustain closeness past a certain point. That constancy under varied input is the finding. It tells you with more rigor than any argument that their behavior was not a function of yours. It was generated internally and it ran on its own schedule. Which means there was no version of your behavior that produced a different outcome, and the search for it is a search through a space that does not contain the object. The reason this question is so persistent despite being answerable is that it protects something. As long as the question is open, you had control. And control, even retrospective control that comes with guilt attached, is more tolerable to most people than the fact that you were in a situation whose outcome you could not influence. Give up the control. What you get in exchange is the removal of a debt you do not owe. The two griefs running at once. Part of the confusion right now is that two separate processes are happening simultaneously and you are experiencing them as one, and separating them clarifies a great deal. The first is grief for the relationship. That behaves like ordinary loss. It comes in waves, attaches to sensory triggers, is worse in the evenings, gradually diminishes over months. It is painful and it is not complicated. It is what happens when something you loved is gone. The second is a shock response to the betrayal itself, and it does not behave like grief at all. Its features are different: intrusive imagery, compulsive checking, a need to know details that do not help once known, a sense of unreality, hypervigilance that has no target. These need different handling, and most people apply the treatment for one to the other, which is why nothing seems to work. The grief needs to be felt. It responds to being allowed. Crying helps, talking helps, sitting with it helps, and it moves through on its own schedule if it is not obstructed. The shock response does not respond to being felt. Feeling it more does nothing. It responds to physiological intervention and to the reduction of intrusive input, which is why the practical advice about sleep and exercise and information cutoff is not incidental. It is the only lever that operates on that system. Try to notice which one is active. If what has arrived is sadness attached to a memory, let it happen. If what has arrived is a compulsion to check something or a loop about details, that is the other system, and the correct response is physical rather than emotional. Getting this distinction right can cut months off the process, and almost nobody is told about it. What made you vulnerable to this person specifically? There is a pattern worth examining, not to assign blame, but because the pattern is the only thing that repeats. You were available to a relationship in which love had to be earned through effort. That is not universal. Plenty of people encounter an inconsistent partner in month 2 and simply leave without agonizing because the inconsistency does not register to them as a challenge or as a familiar condition. It registers as a mismatch and they exit. For you, it registered as something else, probably as chemistry, probably as depth. Almost certainly as familiar in a way you could not have articulated at the time. That familiarity is the thing to look at, because a certain quality of unavailability produced a particular alertness in you, and the alertness felt like recognition, and recognition felt like significance. The origin of that is usually early. An environment in which attention was not automatically available and had to be secured, in which a caregiver's mood governed the temperature of the house, in which love was present but conditional, or present but unreliable, or present but distracted. A child in that environment learns that love is a thing you work for, and the working becomes fused with the loving, and by adulthood a relationship that does not require effort does not feel like love. It feels like nothing, flat, missing something. That is the actual vulnerability, not naivety, not poor judgment. A calibration installed long before you had any say in it, which makes the wrong thing feel right and the right thing feel absent. It is changeable, not through decision but through exposure. The signal that currently reads as chemistry can, over time and with enough contrary experience, come to read as fatigue. That shift is the real recovery, and it is slow, and it is the thing that determines whether this happens once or 3 times. A word about your own behavior in the aftermath. You have probably done things in the past weeks or months that you are ashamed of, and they should be handled properly rather than added to the pile. You may have checked things you promised yourself you would not check. You may have sent a message you regret. You may have said something to a mutual friend that you wish you had kept. You may have asked for details you did not need repeatedly, in a way that felt undignified even while you were doing it. All of that is standard. It is not a character failure, and it is not evidence that you are handling this badly. The behavior that follows betrayal is produced by a system that has registered a major threat and is attempting to resolve it through information gathering. The gathering feels purposeful from inside, and it has no terminal condition, which is why it goes on past the point of usefulness and into the region that produces shame. The shame is worth addressing because it compounds. The original injury was done to you. The shame about your response to it is self-administered, and it is entirely optional, and it does considerable additional damage. Treat those episodes the way you would treat a friend's, with some sympathy for the state that produced them and no ongoing prosecution. They happened during the worst period of your life so far, and they were not your best moments, and they are over. And if you break your own rules again, which you probably will at least once more, do the same thing. Note that it happened. Note that it made things worse rather than better, which it did. Return to the plan. The plan does not require perfection to work, and treating each lapse as a collapse is the most reliable way to abandon it entirely. The detail you cannot stop thinking about. There is usually one, not the largest fact, not the general shape of what happened, but one specific detail that lodges and will not dissolve. A date. A place that meant something to you and turned out to have meant something else at the same time. A sentence they said to you on a particular evening that you now know was said while something else was true. A gift. A photograph you remember taking. That detail has disproportionate power, and the reason is structural rather than emotional. It is the point where 2 incompatible versions of reality touch. Everywhere else, you can hold the old version and the new version as separate accounts of separate periods. In that one detail, they occupy the same moment, and the mind cannot render both at once, and so it keeps trying, and each attempt fails, and the failure feels like the pain of the thing itself. That is what is happening when you cannot stop returning to it. It is not that this detail is the worst part. It is that it is unrenderable, and the mind does not abandon unrenderable material. It reattempts it. There is no clever resolution to this. What happens eventually is that the 2 versions stop competing, because the new one becomes the settled account and the old one becomes a memory of a belief rather than a live representation. That transition happens through time, and it cannot be forced. What helps in the meantime is knowing that the intensity of your fixation on that specific detail is not a measure of its importance. It is a measure of its structural incompatibility. You are not obsessing because the detail is uniquely terrible. You are obsessing because your mind has encountered something it cannot file, and filing failures produce repetition. Let it repeat without treating each repetition as a fresh wound. It thins out. The people who knew. There may be people who knew before you did, and this produces a secondary injury that deserves its own treatment. The discovery that others held this information while you did not is, for many people, nearly as painful as the original fact. It introduces a retroactive humiliation into every interaction with those people during that period. Every ordinary conversation is re-examined for what they were withholding. A few things about this. Most people who know something like this do not act on it, and the reason is not indifference. Intervening in someone else's relationship almost never goes well for the intervener, frequently results in the messenger being blamed and the relationship continuing, and costs the friendship in either outcome. That calculation is made quickly and mostly unconsciously, and it is not a betrayal in itself. Some of them did not know in the way you are imagining. They had a suspicion, an ambiguous observation, something they were not sure about. In hindsight, it looks like knowledge. At the time, it was a fragment, and acting on a fragment about someone else's marriage or relationship is a serious thing that most people will not do. And a small number will have genuinely known and said nothing for reasons that are about their own comfort, and those relationships may not survive this, and that is a real additional loss that should be counted rather than minimized. The thing not to do is spend the next year litigating who knew what. It will not produce a satisfying account, it will damage relationships you need right now, and the energy involved is energy you do not currently have in surplus. If there is one person whose silence genuinely changed something, have one conversation with them, say what you need to say, then let the outcome be whatever it is. Why understanding this has not made it stop hurting. You have probably read a great deal by now and understood most of it, and noticed that the understanding has not reduced the pain by any measurable amount. That is worth explaining because the failure is being misread as a personal failure. Understanding operates in one system. Attachment pain operates in another. They are not connected in the direction you want. You can hold with complete conviction that this person was not good for you, that the relationship was damaging, that you would not want it back, and the system will continue producing longing and distress regardless because it does not read your conclusions. This is why people find themselves in the strange position of missing someone they do not want. That is not a contradiction. It is two processes running in parallel in different parts of the same person. The implication is that you should stop trying to resolve the feeling by improving your understanding. Your understanding is already sufficient. You could not explain this situation more clearly than you already can, and further clarity will produce no further relief. What actually reduces it is time plus the absence of reinforcement. Every contact, every image, every new detail resets the extinction process. That is the whole mechanism, and it is why the practical advice about cutting the information flow is not moralism about self-respect. It is the only lever that operates on the system that is actually generating your pain. The feeling will outlast the understanding by a long margin. That gap is normal, everyone reports it, and it closes on its own schedule and not on the schedule of your insight. What you are entitled to now. There is a set of things that are yours to claim and that you are probably not claiming because the habits of the relationship are still running. You are entitled to describe what happened to you plainly to the people in your life without softening it to protect someone who did not protect you. You are entitled to be unavailable, to not respond, to not provide an explanation for your own boundaries. The requirement to justify your own limits was a feature of that relationship, and it does not transfer to your life now. You are entitled to take up space in your own recovery, to be the one who is having a hard time, to not be, for a period, the person managing everyone else's comfort. You have been the emotional infrastructure for a long time, and you are allowed to be, for some months, someone who is being carried rather than carrying. You are entitled to your anger, in whatever size it turns out to be, without converting it into understanding for anyone's benefit, including your own. You are entitled to not forgive on any particular timeline or at all. Forgiveness is frequently prescribed as a stage of recovery, and it is not one. Some people arrive at it and some do not, and the ones who do not are not stuck. What matters is whether the thing occupies your daily life, not whether you have reached a particular disposition toward the person who caused it, and you are entitled to have this have been serious. There will be pressure from various directions to scale it down, to move on faster, to not let it define a period of your life. Resist that. It was serious. Something significant happened to you. Treating it as small in order to be easy for others is the exact habit that made the whole thing possible. The timeline of how this resolves. It helps to know the shape in advance because the shape is consistent, and knowing it prevents you from misreading the difficult stretches as failure. The first 2 weeks are not grief. They are shock, which is a different state with different features. Functional numbness alternating with waves of something much sharper, disrupted eating and sleeping. Performing normally at work in a way that surprises you and then falling apart in a car park. None of this is a measure of how much you cared. Weeks 3 through 10 are the worst, and they are where the compulsive behavior lives. This is the timeline running period, the checking period, the 3 in the morning period. Almost everyone breaks their own rules at some point in this stretch. If you do note that it made things worse, return to the plan. Somewhere in the 3rd month something shifts subtly. The thoughts do not stop, but they lose charge. You think about it and there is not a full body response. This is the first real evidence, and it is easy to miss because it registers as an absence rather than as an improvement. Months 4 through 9 are a long flat stretch that people find unexpectedly hard because the acute pain has been replaced by something duller and more persistent, and the reasons not to make contact have become abstract. Get through it by making it boring rather than heroic. Framing each day as a triumph of will keeps the thing in the foreground, and things in the foreground stay alive. Somewhere in the second half of the first year, if the information flow has genuinely been cut, the reorganization happens. Not a moment, a gradual change in what your mind spends its time on. You notice, retrospectively, that a week passed without them coming up, then a month. For betrayal specifically, the timeline runs longer than for an ordinary ending, usually by several months, and there is frequently a residual hypervigilance in new relationships that persists past the point where the grief has resolved. That is the last thing to go, and it goes through exposure to reliability rather than through time alone. The single largest variable in all of it is contact. With contact, there is no reliable timeline because the process cannot complete what a good recovery looks like from outside. It is worth describing because you may be measuring yourself against an image that is wrong. A good recovery does not look like serenity. It does not look like a person who has processed everything and speaks about it with detachment and has extracted the lesson and is grateful for the growth. That image circulates widely and it describes almost nobody. A good recovery looks like a person who is functioning while being in pain, who's going to work and maintaining friendships and eating meals while also, several times a day, being briefly overwhelmed, who has bad weeks and then better ones and then a bad one again with no apparent cause. It looks like someone who is still occasionally checking, less than before, who still has a night once a month where they read old messages, who has not achieved forgiveness and is not working on it. The markers of a good recovery are not emotional, they are behavioral, and there are three. The first is that the information flow is trending towards zero, unevenly but trending. The second is that new material is entering your life, not necessarily exciting material, just new. A different route, a new person, a project, an interest, anything that occupies the mind with something other than the past. The third is that you are able to be with other people imperfectly, without performing being fine, and without the encounter costing you a full day. If those three are happening, the recovery is on track regardless of how you feel, and how you feel is not a reliable instrument at the moment and should not be used for navigation. Why you do not need to understand them any better. There is one more thing to release, and it is the thing you are most attached to, because it is the thing you are best at. You do not need to understand them any further. You have an extremely detailed model of this person. You know their history, their triggers, the shape of their defenses, the origin of the pattern, the specific circumstances that produce the specific act. You could give a more accurate psychological account of them than they could give of themselves, and you have probably been refining it continuously since it happened. That refinement feels like progress, and it is not. Past a certain point, understanding another person's mechanism is a way of remaining in relationship with them. It keeps them as the primary object of your attention. It converts your recovery into a research project with them at the center, and there is a specific way this works that is worth naming. Understanding produces the sensation of control. If you can fully explain why it happened, then it becomes comprehensible, and comprehensible things feel manageable, and manageable things feel less like something that was done to you. But it was done to you, and no amount of comprehension changes that, and the pursuit of a complete explanation is a way of not accepting a fact that does not require explanation to be true. You know enough, you have known enough for some time. Everything further is elaboration on a conclusion that was already reached, and the elaboration is costing you days. Turn the instrument around. The same capacity for detailed modeling, pointed at your own patterns rather than theirs, will produce something useful. Pointed at them, it produces nothing except a more refined portrait of someone who is not in your life, the thing that will surprise you most. Somewhere in the middle of this, something arrives that almost nobody anticipates, and it is confusing when it comes. Relief. Specific, unmistakable relief about a thing you cannot immediately identify. It usually arrives during something ordinary, and what it is about is the cessation of the work. The realization that you are not currently managing anyone's mood, that you have not checked a phone with dread in some number of weeks, that you can say what you think without running it through a filter. That there is no ongoing situation requiring interpretation. The relief coexists with grief, and people expect emotions to be exclusive. They are not. You can miss someone enormously and be relieved they are gone simultaneously, and both are accurate readings of different aspects of the same situation. What the relief tells you is how much labor was involved. You will not have known. The labor was continuous and therefore invisible, the way a background noise becomes inaudible until it stops. And when it stops, the quiet is startling, and the startle is your first accurate measurement of what you were carrying. Take that measurement seriously. It is the most reliable evidence you will get about what the relationship actually was. because it is generated by your body rather than by your narrative, and bodies do not construct favorable accounts. What you will say about this in 5 years. The account you eventually give of this is much shorter than the one you would give now, and it is worth knowing that, because the current length is a feature of the acute phase rather than of the event. It will be something like, I was with someone for a few years who could not really be in it, and then something happened that ended it, and that was a very hard year. That is the whole thing at distance. Not because it was small, but because time compresses, and the enormous detail currently occupying your mind will not survive the compression, since most of that detail is generated by the attempt to solve something rather than by the thing itself. People who are 5 years past this describe it consistently as a hinge point rather than as a wound. They locate something specific that changed in them, and the something is almost always the same. They stopped overriding their own perception. They started acting on what they noticed instead of waiting until it became undeniable. That is what you are in the process of learning, expensively, and it will pay for itself repeatedly across the rest of your life in situations that have nothing to do with romance, in work, in friendships, in every context where you have historically waited for permission to trust your own read. The lesson is not about betrayal. It is about the gap between perceiving and acting, and you have now had that gap demonstrated at maximum cost, which is an unpleasant way to learn something and also an unusually durable one. The sentence that was already in you. Here is the thing that actually needs attention, and it is not the relationship. The betrayal hurt more than the facts of it warrant, and the reason is that it confirmed something you were already carrying, some older sentence about yourself. Something about not being the priority, or not being enough to hold someone's attention, or being the kind of person who gets left for something else. That sentence predates them by decades. It was installed somewhere early by someone else in an environment where attention was scarce or divided or conditional, and it has been sitting there ever since, dormant, looking for confirmation, and this event arrived and fit it perfectly, which means the pain you are experiencing is the current event plus everything it is standing in for, arriving together, indistinguishable from each other. That is why it feels bottomless, because the bottom is not in this relationship, it is somewhere much further back. Recognizing this does not dissolve it, but it does relocate the work. The relationship is over and understood. The older sentence is still running and is now better armed than it was, and it is the thing that will determine your next 20 years if it goes unaddressed. That is worth serious attention, and it is the kind of attention that genuinely benefits from working with someone trained for it. Templates installed that early do not usually yield to individual effort, and there is no reason to attempt the hardest available thing entirely alone. Two things that are both true. To close the substance, hold both of these at once, because holding only one produces a distortion. The first is that this was not about your worth. Nothing that happened measured you. The mechanism was structural, the compartment existed independently of anything you did, and the act would have occurred regardless of how you had behaved, provided you were a person who required an ordinary amount of honesty. The second is that you participated in the years before it. You stayed after you knew things were not right. You accepted terms that were not acceptable to you. You suppressed requirements rather than enforcing them, and the suppression extended the situation and left you exposed to something that a shorter relationship would not have exposed you to. Both are true and they do not cancel. The first prevents you from carrying a false deficiency forward. The second gives you something to actually change, which is the only useful output of any of this. If you hold only the first, you become someone to whom things happen, which is a comfortable position with no exit. If you hold only the second, you become someone blaming themselves for a system they did not build, which is where you probably are now, and which is not accurate. Together, they produce something workable. It was not about your worth, and there is something to do differently, and the something is not becoming smaller or more guarded. It is acting on your own perceptions earlier in a smaller form, before the evidence has to become catastrophic in order to be permitted. That is the whole adjustment. It requires nobody's cooperation, and it is available immediately. Why the ruin is not your business. There is a reason to set their trajectory down that goes beyond the practical, and it is worth stating because the practical argument alone rarely persuades anyone. Watching a consequence unfold requires you to remain in the position of the person it was done to. That is the structural problem. To track their ruin, you have to keep occupying the role of victim, because the ruin only matters from that vantage point. It is a story about what was done to you and how the doing eventually cost them, and you cannot be interested in it without standing where the injury happened, which means every day spent monitoring is a day spent inhabiting the worst version of yourself available. Not the version who is building something, the version who is owed something. That role is comfortable in a specific way. It contains moral clarity, which is scarce and pleasant. It provides an explanation for any current difficulty, and it never requires you to do anything because the resolution is supposed to arrive from outside. The cost is that it is static, nothing develops from it. You can occupy it for a decade and be exactly where you started, with more accumulated evidence and no more life. Stepping out of it is not generosity toward them, and it is not forgiveness, and it does not require you to conclude that what happened was acceptable. It only requires you to stop standing in the place where it happened, which is a location rather than a judgment. The alternative position does not have a good name. It is something like, that occurred, it was serious, it is over, and my attention is now allocated elsewhere. That position is less satisfying, and it is the only one that leads anywhere, what you actually have now. Take an inventory because the current accounting is being done badly. You have a complete account of what happened. You were the one paying attention, so you came out with the full record, including the parts they never registered. Unpleasant to hold right now and enormously valuable later, because a complete account is what makes a pattern non-repeatable. You have a calibrated instrument. You now know exactly what it feels like when your perception is accurate and being overridden. That signature is permanent, and it will fire early in future situations before your analysis catches up. You have proof that you survive things. That is not a platitude. It is direct evidence about your capacity under maximum load, gathered under conditions you would not have chosen and available for the rest of your life. You have your time back. Not the years that passed, which are gone, and which you are allowed to grieve without the grief meaning you wasted your life. The ones ahead, the ones that would have gone into continuing, which is the actual quantity at stake, and which is much larger than the amount already spent, and you have the capacity itself, uncontaminated. The attention, the patience, the willingness to go first, the ability to love someone difficult, that is real ability, and it belongs to you regardless of the environment where it was learned. Pointed at someone capable of receiving it, it is the thing that will make you an extraordinary partner rather than an exhausted one. None of that is compensation. Nothing compensates. It is simply what is in your possession, and it is more than the current accounting is crediting you with. The small practice that does the most. If everything else here is too much to carry, there is one practice, and it takes seconds at a time. When you notice a perception forming about someone, act on it within days rather than months, not dramatically, not by ending things. By saying the small version of it out loud early while it is still minor, before the evidence has had to accumulate into something undeniable. Something feels different lately. That is the sentence. 9 words said in week 1 of a change rather than in month 6. Not an accusation, not a case, not a compilation of examples, just the observation delivered plainly once. What that does is convert a private accumulating suspicion into an exchange, which is where information comes from, and the response tells you almost everything. A person who is fine will engage with it. A person who is not will do one of a small number of recognizable things, and you will know within a week, and knowing within a week instead of within a year is the entire benefit. The reason this matters more than anything else in here is that the thing that cost you was never the betrayal itself. It was the gap, the months in which you knew something and did not act because acting had been made expensive by a person who benefited from your silence. Close the gap and everything else takes care of itself. You cannot control who deceives you. You can absolutely control how long you spend overriding your own read, and that is where the years actually go. Practice it in small places first, at work, with friends, anywhere the impulse arises to notice something and say nothing. You are already an excellent observer. That was never the deficiency. You have been observing accurately for years while declining to act, and the only change required is to close the distance between those two things. What it means that they kept a compartment. Return to the structure once more, because there is an implication in it that most people miss, and that reframes the whole relationship rather than just its ending. The compartment was not created for the betrayal. It predated it, probably by decades. It was in place before they met you, and it was in place during the good years, and its existence was the precondition for their being able to be in a relationship at all. Which means that at every point in that relationship, including the periods you remember as the best ones, there was a part of them that was structurally unavailable to you, not hidden as a deception, reserved as a condition of participation. That is a very difficult thing to absorb, and it recontextualizes memories you were relying on, the weekend you think about. The conversation at 2 in the morning, those were real, and they were also occurring in a relationship where a portion of the person was permanently held back, and you did not have access to it and never would have. The reason this is worth saying is not to poison the good memories. It is to correct an inference you are probably making, which is that things were fine and then something broke them. Nothing broke. The structure that produced the betrayal was the same structure that produced the years of ambiguity, the withdrawals, the vagueness about the future, the sense you had throughout that some part of them was somewhere else. You were not imagining that, it was accurate. You were detecting an actual architectural feature continuously for years and being told it was not there. That means the betrayal was not a departure from the relationship. It was the relationship's logic taken one step further, which is worse in one sense and considerably better in another, because it means you were not blindsided by something that came from nowhere. You had the information the whole time. What you lacked was permission to act on it. Why you will not be this person again. There is a fear underneath this that surfaces mostly at night, and it is worth answering directly. The fear is that you will do this again. That there is something in you that seeks this out, that you will be drawn to the same configuration, that in 5 years you will be sitting in another version of this room having learned nothing. You will not, and the reason is not increased vigilance or better rules, both of which are unreliable. It is that something has changed at a level below decision. You now have a somatic memory of what this feels like from the inside, the particular quality of the anxiety, the specific texture of composing a message for 40 minutes, the sensation of a conversation that produced agreement and changed nothing, the feeling of noticing something and talking yourself out of it. Those are stored in your body now, not in your reasoning, and they will fire early. In a future situation with the same shape, you will feel it before you understand it. That firing is faster and more reliable than any rule you could construct. There is one caution, which is that the system will overfire for a while. Ordinary human inconsistency will trigger it. Everyone is occasionally distracted, occasionally slow, occasionally not at their best. The pattern is not any single instance. It is the shape across time. Give people 6 weeks. Watch the shape rather than the instance. Trust the detection but verify before acting on it. And know that the overfiring is temporary and it settles, and that the settling happens through repeated exposure to people who turn out to be reliable, which requires being around people, which is why isolation extends this longer than anything else. The part of you that wants to have been wrong. There is a wish that will visit you at intervals for a long time, and it is worth naming so that its arrival does not feel like a failure of resolve. You will want it to have been a mistake, not their mistake, a mistake in the information. Some version of events where the thing you learned turns out to have been misread, and the person you thought you knew is the person after all. That wish will arrive with force, and it will feel almost like a memory rather than a hope. It comes most often on waking in the few seconds before the day reassembles, when the old version of your life is still the operative one. Those seconds are among the worst in the whole process, and almost nobody warns people about them. You wake, and for a moment nothing has happened, and then it happens again, freshly, and it will do this every morning for some weeks, and then intermittently for months. That is not a sign that you are refusing to accept it. It is a feature of how memory reconsolidates during sleep, and it fades on its own, and there is nothing to be done about it except to know that it is standard and that the number of mornings decreases. The wish itself is also not a problem. It is what love does when it has nowhere to go. It does not mean you would take them back. It does not mean you are stuck. It means a part of you formed an attachment that operated for years and does not update on the schedule of your conclusions. Let it visit. Do not argue with it and do not act on it. It is finite and it thins, and one morning you will wake and the day will reassemble without the 2-second gap, and you will not notice it happening. What to do this week? The analysis is finished. What remains is practical, and it is short, and it matters more than everything above it. Cut the information flow to zero, not partially. Every fragment restarts the process, and the process is what is consuming you rather than the underlying fact, which is static and has already done its damage. Unfollow, mute, and have the 90-second conversation with the 2 or 3 people who have access to news about them. Most people comply immediately and are relieved to be told. Protect sleep as if it were medical, because in this instance it is. A dysregulated system produces the loop, and the loop produces the behavior you are ashamed of afterwards, and both are downstream of sleep more than of anything psychological. Move your body daily, for longer than feels reasonable, preferably outdoors. This is not wellness advice. It is the only intervention that reliably discharges the specific physiological state you are in. Put the objects somewhere, not destroyed, not deleted, relocated out of the daily path so that they are encountered by choice rather than by accident. The goal is control over timing, not erasure. Tell one person the whole thing without softening it, not for advice. To stop being the only one who holds the complete account, which is a specific burden, and is much of what is making this so heavy. And put one new thing into your life this week. Small, not a transformation, a class, a route, a standing arrangement with someone, anything that occupies attention and did not exist before. The mind allocates itself to whatever is most alive, and if the most alive thing in your life is a concluded relationship, that is where it goes regardless of your intentions. That is the whole list. None of it is emotional work. All of it determines how long this takes, what other people get wrong about this. Because you will encounter a great deal of material on this subject, and much of it will point you somewhere expensive, it is worth naming the common errors. The first is the promise that they will come back once they understand. This is the most widely circulated idea in this space, and it functions as a form of waiting with better branding. Some do come back. The return is exploratory rather than transformed, and organizing your recovery around its possibility means your recovery cannot complete, because completion would require you to stop waiting, and waiting is the whole structure. The second is the instruction to forgive, presented as a necessary stage. It is not a stage. Some people arrive at it and some do not, and the ones who do not are not stuck. What determines whether you are stuck is whether the thing occupies your daily life, not whether you have reached a particular disposition toward the person who caused it. Being told you must forgive in order to heal adds a task to a person who is already at capacity. The third is the framing of the whole thing as a lesson you were meant to receive. That framing requires the harm to have been purposeful in some larger sense, and it puts you in the position of finding meaning in something that was simply someone else's failure. You are allowed to conclude that this was a bad thing that happened and that you extracted something useful from it, and that the extraction does not justify the event. The fourth is the encouragement to track their downfall. That is the one this whole thing is titled after, and it deserves the most direct treatment. The consequences are real. They are also not a project you have any part in, and every hour spent monitoring them is an hour in which the person who hurt you is still setting the agenda for your day. The fifth is the suggestion that you should be over it by some particular point. There is no point. There is a rough shape and enormous individual variation, and being slower than the shape suggests is not a failure and does not mean you loved too much or handled it badly. The last thing about their life. Since the title raises it, one final honest treatment, and then it is closed for good. They had no idea, not because they were stupid. Because the instrument that would have told them was the one their whole life was organized around keeping offline, and what that produced is not a spectacular collapse. It is something quieter and more permanent, which is a person who now knows the value of something they were structurally unable to hold, carrying that knowledge through every subsequent room forever, with no mechanism for resolving it and no one they can say it to. That is the ruin. It is real. It is happening, or it will, and it is not your compensation. It does not arrive in a form you can receive. It produces no event you will witness, and no moment in which the ledger balances, and no message in which they finally articulate what they took. The only thing in this entire situation that is actually yours is the time on the other side of it. That is the whole return, and it is substantial, and it is available the moment you stop allocating any of it to the question of what is happening over there. They spent something they did not know the value of. You are still holding yours, the story you are writing right now. There is a decision being made in these weeks, quietly, and it will govern more of your life than the relationship did. The decision is what this event means about you, and it is being made under the worst possible conditions, by a version of you that is exhausted and in pain and operating on incomplete information, and whatever it concludes will feel like a permanent discovery rather than a temporary interpretation. That is why it is worth being deliberate now, before the conclusion sets. There are two available readings and both fit the facts. In the first, you were betrayed because something about you invited it or failed to prevent it, and that something is a property you carry forward into every future relationship. In the second, you were in a relationship with a person who maintained a compartment that had nothing to do with you, and the compartment produced an outcome, and none of it measured you. Both explain everything that happened. Neither can be proven. The evidence is compatible with both, which means the choice between them is not an empirical question. It is a decision about which story to live inside. That may sound like an invitation to comfort yourself with a convenient belief. It is not. It is a description of the actual epistemic situation, which is that you do not have access to the truth of another person's interior and never will, and that in the absence of access you are choosing. Choose the second, not because it is kinder. Because it has more support from everything else you observed across years, because the first requires a mechanism nobody can name, and because the second produces a person who can be loved while the first produces a person who is permanently auditioning. You will not believe it immediately. Beliefs installed by pain do not yield to argument. But you can decide which one to act as though is true, and acting is what eventually produces belief, and never the other way around. Being alone with it for now. There is a stretch of this where you will be more alone than you have been in a long time, and it should be described accurately rather than softened, because the softened version makes people feel they are failing. The relationship, whatever else it was, occupied space. There was someone to think about, someone whose state you were tracking, a situation that structured your attention and gave your days a subject. That is gone, and what replaces it initially is not freedom, it is vacancy. The vacancy is worse in specific places. The end of the day, Sundays. The moment after something good happens and there is no one to tell, waking up. These are the times when the absence has a shape and they will be difficult for months, and there is no technique that removes them. What there is instead is the slow business of putting other things in those slots, not replacements for the person, which is not possible and not the point, but occupants for the times. A standing arrangement on a Sunday, someone you call at the end of the day, a thing you do on waking that is yours. Those feel pathetically inadequate as substitutes for what was there. They are not substitutes, they are scaffolding, and scaffolding is not supposed to be beautiful. It is supposed to hold a structure while something is being built underneath it. And there is something being built underneath, though you cannot see it and will not be able to for some time. What is being built is a version of your life that does not require another person's participation in order to have a shape. That is genuinely valuable, and most people never build it, because most people move directly from one relationship to the next and never find out what their own life looks like unaccompanied. You are going to find out, not by choice. And what almost everyone reports on the other side is that the period they dreaded most turned out to be the one that changed the most. What love actually was in that relationship. One correction before the end, because it affects what you carry forward. You may be starting to believe that the love was not real, that if they could do what they did, then nothing that came before was what you thought it was, that the whole thing was a performance and you were the only one in it. That conclusion is common after betrayal, and it is usually wrong, and believing it costs you something specific, which is your own history. What was real was your side, entirely. Every hour of attention you paid, every accurate perception you had, every act of care you performed, none of that was contingent on their reciprocation. You did those things and they were real acts, and their reality does not depend on what was happening in someone else's compartment. What was real on their side is harder to determine, and is probably also more than you can currently accept. Avoidant people love. The love is frequently intense, and it is structurally difficult to deliver, and the difficulty in delivering it does not retroactively convert it into fraud. A person can be genuinely attached to someone and still do something catastrophic, because attachment and behavior are governed by different systems, and the connection between them is exactly what is broken in this configuration. So the accurate reading is not that it was fake. It is that something real existed in a person who had no reliable way to act in accordance with it. That is sadder than the fraud version, and it is more useful, because the fraud version requires you to conclude that you cannot tell the difference between real and false, which is a conclusion that will follow you into every future relationship and make it impossible to relax. You could tell what you were reading was accurate. There was something there. It was simply attached to a person who could not be trusted to act on it, and those are two different findings, and only the second one is about them. Before you move on. One last thing directed at the part of you still keeping a small light on somewhere. You are allowed to have loved them, fully, without qualification, without the retroactive editing that makes the loss easier to bear. You do not have to convert them into a monster in order to be finished, and you do not have to decide the whole period was worthless in order to leave it behind. There is a version of recovery that requires demolishing the past, and it is faster in the short term, and it costs something, because what gets demolished is not only the relationship but your own capacity to have loved well. And you did love well, that is worth keeping, and it is separable from everything else. You can hold that some of it was real, that they were a person rather than a villain, that certain hours were among the best you have had, and that what happened was serious and unacceptable and cannot be returned to. All of that fits together. Complexity is not indecision. What you are leaving is not the memory, it is the open file. Those are different things, and only one of them is costing you anything. Keep the years, close the file. Nothing further is coming from that direction, and nothing further is needed, and the rest of it is yours. The ordinary morning that is coming. There is a future moment worth holding, and it is small, and it is the actual destination rather than the dramatic thing you might be imagining. It is a morning some distance from here. Nothing is happening in it. You are doing something routine, and their name enters your mind the way names do, attached to nothing in particular, and it produces almost nothing. A small recognition, the way you might think of a place you used to live. You will notice in that moment that you had not thought about them in some length of time you cannot specify. And the not thinking will not have been an achievement. It will simply have been what your mind was doing, which was something else. That is the end of this, not an apology, not a collapse over there. Not the moment they finally understand, not a message that explains everything. Just a morning in which someone who occupied years of your interior life occupies almost none of it, and the reduction happened without your noticing, through nothing but the accumulation of days that contained other material. It is coming, not soon, not on a schedule you control, not through any technique. Through time and the removal of reinforcement and the slow refilling of a space that has been vacant. And when you are in it, the remarkable thing will not be that you got over it. It will be how much of your own life was there the whole time, running underneath, entirely available, obscured by a situation that had already ended. The last thing. They had no idea. That is true, and it is the most important sentence in all of this, and it does not mean what it seems to mean. It does not mean they were innocent. A person is responsible for what they do regardless of what their instrumentation was reporting at the time. The not knowing is an explanation, not a defense, and the distinction matters and should not be blurred by understanding. What it means is that the cause of all this was never a judgment about you. Nobody weighed you. Nobody assessed what you brought and found it insufficient. What happened was produced by a person operating with a broken reading of what was at stake, in a compartment where you were not being considered at all, and the not being considered is a failure of their attention rather than a verdict on your value. That is the whole finding. It is not satisfying, and it is accurate, and accurate is what you actually need, because you are going to be building the next decade on whatever you conclude in these months. Do not build it on the sentence that says you were not enough. That sentence is not supported by anything that happened. It was in you before you met them, installed somewhere earlier, and it has simply found a convincing piece of evidence to attach itself to. Build it on the other one, which is that you loved someone completely, and they could not hold it, and their inability is a fact about them, and your capacity is a fact about you, and only one of those two facts is going anywhere useful. Yours is coming with you.